Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I am interviewing Professor Lloyd A. Newton. Professor Newton, we connected through a Thomistic discussion group or Thomism discussion group, and I was looking for somebody who could explain kind of Aristotelian metaphysics, essentialism, Thomism, those broader concepts and ideas. And the reason why that really matters is because for conservatives, or at least those who hold to natural law theory, we need to understand really the metaphysical underpinnings of that idea and why all of that matters. So let me invite Professor Newton to introduce himself and get things started.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me on. My background is I have my PhD from the University of Dallas. I finished in 2003. I worked on Duns Scotus, who was a contemporary or slightly generation later than Thomas Aquinas. Although I would consider myself more of a Thomist. Since then, I've taught at colleges, both here in the States, in Kansas, and in Texas, and in Belgium, actually, for a semester, and a lot of high school, recently more high school work on Latin. So I've translated some works, not only Aquinas, but Scotus and some other guys from Latin to English as well. So that's a little bit of my background.
All right. So obviously, you know what you're talking about. You know what you're doing. So I think we should just get started right away.
Let's hope.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So today we're talking about first we're talking about this general area of philosophy called metaphysics. So could you explain first what is metaphysics and why does it matter?
Sure. So the term metaphysics comes from the phrase after, from a Greek word meaning after. And so it was not actually a term used by Aristotle. It was a happenstance term. It was applied by a later scholar who found a text by Aristotle that was literally placed in the catalog of works after his work on physics. But that said, it's a good term because it's a study that comes after your study of the physical sciences. Aristotle would have used the study of being, or being insofar as things exist, or he would have used the study of the divine, not so much from a revelation perspective of the Bible or the Quran, but what we can know about God from the natural world. Or he would have said it would have been the first philosophy, the study that comes not first temporally, but first in importance. So those three terms describe what, in a good way, historically, people have understood by metaphysics. So then your second question, why does it matter? Well, I think a good way to think about this is all of us have the rest of our lives to live, and what we do today has consequences tomorrow and years on down the road. I heard an interesting statistic the other day that said there's enough social science data that prison systems can predict based on third grade test scores where prisons need to be built. So if a school district has a lot of third graders failing, they know that in 15 years they need more prisons in this area, which is a shocking statistic to think that we can predict where people will end up based on third grade test scores. But behind that, I think, is the principle that there are consequences to everything you do. So metaphysically, if we take the two basic views, that either there is, say, the Heraclitean view, or the view that says everything in life is a matter of flux and there's nothing permanent, it would be one view, or the essentialist view, which I think you're asking about, that says no, besides the flux that we see around us from day to day, there are permanent things, there are essences, or there are natures to things that we can either live in harmony with or be discordant with. And if we find ourselves in harmony with nature, then things will turn out far better, right? Even if there's tragedy in life, we can wade our way through that tragedy far better than if we have nothing to hold on to.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very beautiful explanation. Wow. So, usually sometimes when philosophers talk about their disciplines, it comes off very dry, but I think what you were getting at is that metaphysics really deals with many of the questions that we really care about, the way
Absolutely.
that we life and reality itself. So I'm ready to get right into the meat of some of these terms.
Great.
So everybody kind of understands that these three terms are used together, or usually sometimes they're used interchangeably. We have Aristotelianism, we have
Yes.
essentialism, and then we have Thomism. So
Correct.
let's first ask, what is the relationship between all three of these things after you've defined them?
I would think of them in terms of general categories and subsets. So I would start with essentialism being the largest category. So taking a historical perspective, Plato, who was the teacher of Aristotle, would have been an essentialist insofar as he believed there were essences and forms to things. His student Aristotle, there seems to be a difference on where those forms are located. Plato seems to think that the forms are out there, whereas Aristotle famously thinks the forms are down here in things. But both thinkers would be essentialists insofar as the way I'm using those terms. So Aristotle would be a subset differing from Plato, an idealist, as to where these essences are located. So that would be, essentialist would be a Genus, and maybe a Platonist or an idealist on the one hand, or an Aristotelian on another. Within Aristotle, you would have, again, branches of people who follow Aristotle. You would have non-Christians, you would have Jewish thinkers, you would have Islamic thinkers, and you would have Christian thinkers, some of whom would be followers of Thomas. There would be other followers, such as Duns Scotus, who would have been an Aristotelian but not a follower of Aquinas. So again, Aristotelianism would be a broader concept, and then Thomism would be one strand within that.
All right, so that actually also gets into some of their differences, right?
Yes.
So I'm interested in understanding, so essentialism is the big term to describe this idea that there are essences, right?
Correct.
And then Aristotle had a particular conception of what essentialism is, so that's a subset, right?
Correct.
And then from Aristotle, you have Thomism, and then you also have Scotus, right?
At least you would have a number of them. So you would have Jewish thinkers. So perhaps I'm not as familiar with some of the Jewish thinkers, but I think Moses Maimonides would be one.
Right. Yeah.
You'd have other Averroes in the Islamic world. You'd have non-Christians who are non-religious people who would have been Aristotelians, so forth. So to be a follower of Aristotle did not necessarily make you a religious person or non-religious person, but there certainly were, within the Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions, there were followers within those sets that followed Aristotle.
All right, so then I think we should just get started now onto what essentialism precisely is.
Sure. So when you look out at the world of flux and you see people growing older or coming and going, the question that, well, let's take the word essence. It comes from a Latin term meaning sort of what is something. So if I see people walking around and I say, what is that? The common answer would be that's a human being or that's a person. In a larger sense, you may lump people together with animals and say, okay, I can classify all these living things together as some kind of animals. Or I might look out and see that things grow and say, these things are all living things. Or if I step back and I look at the world and I see, okay, all the things that I see around me are either living or lifeless, but they are all extended. They're physical things. So they take up space. They have dimensions. They have weight. And then I may even take a step back and say, okay, I see the things in the world that are spatial, that are corporeal, to use a Latin phrase. But then there are things like scientific laws, mathematical truths. Those truths are not things, but yet they exist in the world. So arguably, mathematics and corporeal objects and animals or animated things all have certain natures. So we might say the nature of a corporeal thing, insofar as it is extended in space and time, has certain dimensions and it has weight. And we could know about, we might even think of it along the lines of there would be certain properties of these bodies insofar as they exist, whether they're living or non-living. And then if we look at the classification of things of living and say, well, if they're alive, we know that they're going to grow, they're going to metabolize, and at some point they're going to die. None of the living things that we know of live forever. And then we can take a subcategory and say, okay, of the living things, some of them are animals and some of them are plants. So we can make a basic division of living things. Of the living things, we can think of, again, they would have more properties than the larger, let me rephrase that. Of the animals, they would have more properties than simply living things. So plants and animals together would take in nutrients and metabolize or take in nutrients. Animals would also be able to have some kind of awareness of the world. They would have some kind of ability to move around the world. And then if we look at the smallest subset of human beings, they would have additional properties. Traditionally, in the history of Aristotle, we'd speak about rational animals or humans having the ability to reason and to choose things. So that would be a basic taxonomy, if you will.
Right. So in essence is what makes something really what it is.
Correct.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you for helping me on that.
Yeah. No problem. So then Plato believed that essences exist in some like Platonic realm.
Correct.
And then Aristotle, I think if the proper term is hylomorphic dualism.
That is a correct term.
Essences existed in reality or shared in reality in some way. Could you explain
Sure.
hylomorphic dualism?
Sure. So let's step back and say, okay, that there's these ideas or these essences or these forms, and I'll use those three terms now to be interchangeable. Yeah, you were correct. Plato thinks that those forms seem to exist somewhere out there. At least this is a basic, there may be nuanced views, but that would be a basic intro way to think about it. Aristotle thinks they're located here. Insofar as that I and you are human beings, there's a form or an idea of humanity combined with the particular matter that makes me up. So you use the word hylomorphism. The Greek term morphe is translated as form, and the Greek term hule or hyle is what means wood or matter. So if you look at the individual people walking around at a mall or a shopping center, they all have something that's the same about them, and they're all different. And what makes them the same is their form. They share in common this form or essence. And then on a Thomistic view, or let's just say on a Thomistic view, what makes them an individual is their unique matter. So we'd say these are composite, composed of matter and form.
And I've also heard people talk about the term like prime matter.
Yes.
So, like matter is just kind of this general thing that exists, maybe, or the basic substance that we all share, kind of.
Yeah. So again, if we step back and think, one of the things that's motivating Aristotle is dealing with the problem of change.
Yeah.
So I see colors change, right? I watch the leaves change from green to yellow. I see temperatures change. I'm in Phoenix right now, and it's very hot. But as the evening wears on, it will cool down. If I pour water through a coffee grinds, it will change the color and the temperature and the flavor. And so I see all these changes. I see people grow older and they gain weight or lose weight. And then I see people come into being and they pass away. So I have these fundamental changes, and Aristotle is trying to make sense of them. And the basic way in which he makes sense of these changes is he says there's always a form that they come to hold, insofar as you can identify something, either a color as red or coffee as hot, or a person as a certain age. There's a certain form that is identifiable, and then there's an underlying substance that takes on that. So if the coffee is an example I used to use quite often, when the water changes, it changes from room temperature to hot. It changes from clear to opaque. It changes from tasting like water to tasting like coffee. So the water is the underlying substance, if you will, or underlying thing that takes on either one form or another form. And so these forms are the intelligible opposites, if you will, of a change. And one of the insights of Aristotle is if the coffee goes to becoming hot, or let's say the water becomes hot, it doesn't become hot from just anything. It doesn't become hot from being 3 or from becoming black or anything else. It becomes hot from being not hot. So you have not hot and you have hot, or you have young that becomes old, or not old and old. You would have not alive to becoming alive, or alive to becoming dead. So you have these opposites, and these are known as form and the privation. Word privation in Greek and in Latin is simply the lack of that specific form. So insofar as anything is intelligible, it goes from not having that specific form to having that form. And then there's the underlying matter that takes on one or the other. And that analysis of change takes place at the level of substance and the level of quantities and qualities and so forth. So a moment ago, I gave you sort of a general hierarchical view of the world, and I said, well, there's corporeal things, there are living things, there are animals, there are humans, and that would be a bare breakdown, if you will, or parts and whole way to think about the world. Mm-hmm. The way that this was understood is as we descend down a hierarchical or a taxonic tree, I think that's the right word. We say, okay, there's a substance, and it's either corporeal or incorporeal. And we say corporeal is either living or inanimate, and living things are either plants or animals, and animals are either beasts or humans. In each of those, the higher category is considered to be the matter, and the things underneath them are the two species, which would have their own forms. When I go to the next level, the species becomes the genus, and again, the terms underneath it become the two possibilities. So there's a connection between what's known as Porphyry's tree and hylomorphism. So on a Porphyry's tree, the term genus simply means that it's more general. So the word corporeal applies to all bodily things. The word living applies to half of that or some of that, and non-living would apply to the other half. If I take the word living, it would apply to all plants and animals, and plants would be one portion and animals would be the other. So the term species is always relative to genus, and species simply means a narrower grouping of terms than the genus. So we have sort of a hierarchical structure, and those terms are always relative depending upon how many individuals you're pointing out. So far, so good?
Yeah, so far, so good.
Now, well, I was going to say, when you tie that to the hylomorphism, mm-hmm. the idea is that genus is related to matter, the differentiating principle is related to form, and the species is the composite.
Yeah.
When you go down. Now, you ask about prime matter. When I get to the individual, and I say, okay, you come and you go, so you were conceived, and at some point you'll die. You as a human being have an intelligible form to you, but underlying the flux of your existence, there's something called prime matter. That's the first matter. And the idea behind this is, on this basic analysis, which was ubiquitous up and down this tree, at some point you're going to get to a principle of change that is no longer intelligible. If it were, by definition, if it were intelligible, it would have a form, and it would be composite. But underlying this, again, this sort of a hermeneutic of change, there's always, if there's a change from one intelligible to another, there's some underlying thing. So at some point of analysis, we reach something that is first that is no longer intelligible, and that's prime matter.
So there's a lot that we could do actually with that. There are a lot of different directions. So from what I read from Edward Fazer, right, he talks about how change is the actualization of an entity's potential.
Yes.
So I'm interested in knowing, would he say something like the potential comes from the object's essence, or where would that potential come from for change?
That's a good question. So we say that the potential, I can say this much, the potential is related to the matter, and the actualization is related to the form. So the form actualizes the matter. Where does that come from? There seems to be certain structures built into the universe, and I'm not familiar with the material enough on the question you asked to think about it, or maybe I need a little more time to think about it. But if we think about changes of color, there's a certain, I think just off the top of my head, there's certain structures into the potential of the underlying substance is the way in which it can change, right? So let's think of it, not to color, but let's go to a human being. Mm-hmm. A human being, as he grows up, he's potentially has a number of potentials in front of him, but those potentials are not unlimited. He does not have the potential to grow wings. He does not have the potential to grow 4 arms, right? As he grows up, at some certain point of his age, his baby teeth will fall out, and he'll gain his full teeth. At a certain point of age, he will cross over into puberty. At a certain point in age, he may or may not lose his hair, or his hair may turn gray. So there's certain potentials that are built into his essence, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
That would depend. The problem, I think, with the question of his essence, I don't know that there's simply one essence in the human being, right? This is a question that was debated in the Middle Ages, is how many forms does a person have? Scotus, I mentioned earlier, was different from Aquinas, and from my reading of it, it seems like Scotus would say there's a plurality of forms, of substantial forms that you have, whereas Aquinas has a different nuanced view that would say you only have one, but in your history, you had different forms that came and went, which is a strange view. It's kind of a view somewhat similar to evolution. So the idea, going back to my example a moment ago, there's a certain way in which you have something like the essence of a corporeal being, you have something like the essence of a living being, you have something like the essence of an animal, and at each level they have different properties. So it's your animality that allows you to sense things. Your rationality allows you to choose and to know things. Your living form, your vital principles, are what allows you to metabolize and to grow. At the end of the day, Aquinas is going to say you only have one form, but that one rational form somehow encapsulates virtually, one of the technical terms is that it virtually contains those other forms.
Yeah. I remember, I tried to brush up on some of my terminology before I got into this. So I remember I heard a friend of mine talk about how there's the accidental feature of something, and the substantial feature. So I think the example that he used is that, I think maybe I'm trying to remember the example, but like an accidental feature would be maybe like the skin color of a person.
Sure, absolutely.
But then a substantial feature would be like, I don't know, having a capacity for rationality, maybe. I don't know if that's the right way to think about that.
Well, a lot of this begins with both Aristotle's categories and a work that in the history was actually read before Aristotle, and that was by Porphyry, called the Isagoge. And what you have in the Isagoge is an analysis of language. So you have in every sentences from a logical and a grammatical, really a logical perspective, is breaking down into a subject and a predicate. And what Porphyry does, and he's drawing upon another work of Aristotle, but he simplifies it, and he says your predicates fall into one of 5 classifications. These are known as the 5 universals. A predicate is either related to the subject of a sentence as a genus, as a species, as a difference, and then he gives 2 more categories, a property or an accident. The word property is something that's unique to the subject of a sentence and could not be otherwise. The word accident literally means it could be otherwise. Subsequently in the tradition, there were 2 kinds of accidents that were necessary to the subject and accidents that were, as you described them, that could be otherwise. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I say this is if we take human beings as mortal, technically speaking, mortal is not a proper property of men or human beings. It's a property of living things. It would be an essential accident or a necessary accident of human beings. But it was so. If I look at sort of a tree and I'd say the accident of being mortal is more broad than the term human being. The term human being only picks out the individuals out there that are walking around on 2 legs that are rational. But living picks out the animals and the plants, and mortal also picks out the animals and plants and human beings. So they have the same, in logical terms, extension. So mortal would be a property of living beings. Mortal would be an inseparable accident of human beings. And then, yes, your skin color, your hair color, any of those things would be accidents in the sense that they could be otherwise.
So like when you say being mortal is an inseparable accident of living human beings, right?
Yes.
is that kind of just like implying like, like potentially there could be like an immortal human, or it's saying that all men don't necessarily have to be mortal? Like, what is that suggesting?
No, it's not saying that at all. Behind this is all of this is studied in the historically when Aquinas and Scotus were alive in a series of works that were comprised logic. So you may know that the 7 liberal arts had grammar and logic as the first 2 courses. And logic was not just about argumentation, but this was the scientific method of the day. So that what's driving these questions is our desire for, in some sense, certainty or knowledge of the world. And what the Aristotelians and the Thomists were looking for was the relationship between the subject term and the predicate to see how these two lined up. Something similar could be said in math, which would be another kind of science. We could speak of about a triangle and the interior angles of the triangle having the same being equal to 180 degrees or equal to a straight line. So if we could find that the subject, the interior angles of a triangle are equal to a straight line, then we have mapped out sort of in the world the relationship between a subject and a predicate. So trying to figure out how these relationships, and the reason why this is important in language is that language maps onto the world.
Mm-hmm.
Conversely, when I see things in the world, Aristotle and Aquinas thinks that my mind abstracts the form of things, and the whole idea of information is that the form is somehow in my mind, and the form is also out there. So you mentioned hylomorphism earlier. Triangular things in the world have the form of a triangle, not the substance. So triangle is not a substance, but it's an accident. Mm-hmm. Living things have the form of life, and then trying to map onto that certain features or certain predicates. Those forms in the world are the same forms in my mind. So there's one view of truth is that truth is sort of this correspondence between my mind and the world. Aristotle's view is even stronger than that. It's not just that my mind somehow corresponds to the world, but that my mind is actually identical to the way things are.
Yeah.
The mind is not, now we wouldn't use the word hylomorphism to describe the forms in my mind, because the mind for Aristotle is immaterial, so there's no matter in my mind. This is also gets on the difference between, say, the brain and the mind for Aristotle. Another topic that you may want to talk about at some point.
Mm-hmm. Wait, so let me just make sure. I think I might have misunderstood then what you meant by, you said a necessary accident?
Yes, so some accidents would be necessary to a substance.
All right.
Not have the same extension.
Oh, right? So a living, yeah.
So all living things would necessarily die, and that would be a property. So property here has the unique meaning, or the meaning of uniqueness. So they have the exact same, the reason why something is mortal is because it's living. Humans are one subset of living things, so they will also have the property, I shouldn't say property, they will also have the attribute of dying, of being mortal. But as far as the extension of these two terms, they're not co-extensive. Mm-hmm. Human beings as a subset, mortal is a broader term. And the science that's driving the Middle Ages is trying to find the exact same subset between subject and predicate. We want to make sure our terms are equally applicable to the things in the world. So if I have a term that's broader, or if the subject is broader than the predicate, things are out of balance. And my knowledge will be, I won't have the same degree of knowledge, or I may not have knowledge at all. So trying to find my subjects and predicates to have the same extensive coverage is what's driving this. And so the distinction to say that some things are necessary accidents, the way I'm using it simply says they have different extensive coverage of the world.
Mm-hmm. All right, that makes sense. So going back to Aristotle's idea on change, I remember one time I wrote a paper about, like embryo ethics and so forth.
Sure.
And I mean, this gets into ethics, but this is also like a really helpful example. So for like the embryo, right, as it's developing in the womb, people would still consider it to be, in some sense, at least from our tradition, essentialist, Aristotelian, and so forth, that it's still the same kind of being as us. So somebody might say, well, look, it can't exercise rationality immediately like us. But I'd say, no, it has that potential by
Yes.
virtue of the kind of being it is.
Yes.
So the thing that I'm getting at is that there are some changes that happen when they're superimposed onto things. So for
Correct.
example, like I'd have to force a tree to, cut it and then make it into a house,
Correct.
right? But on the other hand, my capacity to be rational did not come from something superimposing change onto me, but from within my inherent powers.
Correct. That's a nice way to think about it. Yes.
All right. So I just want to make sure that I had that understanding right. So,
Yes,
okay.
you have it spot on.
All right. That's good. So, okay. I kind of worried. I told you that I was relatively new to the tradition, and I was scared I was going to butcher and mess something up. All right. So, there's a lot of places that we could go here. I'm right now. I don't know if you can see it on the screen. Probably not. Let me actually share my screen really quick. So recently I've been going online and I found on a Catholic library online a copy of, Scholastic Metaphysics by Edward Feser.
Yes.
And, I was looking at the table of contents and trying to understand some of the terms. So I think we can probably just go through this table of contents and have you maybe discuss some of the ideas there. So what would be act and potency?
So again, these are two correlative terms. A potency is simply a potential to become a certain thing, and once it has become actually that. So a child of 9 years of age has the potential to become an adult of 20 years of age, or maybe a 9-year-old has a potential to become a 10-year-old. So the two are mutually exclusive. If the coffee is potentially cold, then it's not actually cold. It could be actually frozen or it could be actually hot, but insofar as cold picks out at something between frozen and boiling hot or somewhere in there, we could maybe narrow it down to more precise terms. Besides, cold is kind of a vague term, but if the water is black, then it's no, that's a bad example. If the water before it goes through the coffee grinds is clear, then it's potentially black. It's not actually black. So potency and act, or potential and actual, are ways to describe the world as we think about change. So as we do look at the world, and again, this goes back to my initial sort of claims or beginning about the world, we see the world is constantly in flux. The world is constantly changing. But as we step back, we see that there are patterns in the world. We see that when people conceive, when humans conceive, they don't conceive monkeys. They don't conceive dogs. When dogs copulate, they don't produce cats. They produce more dogs, right? So we see that there's that there are kinds of things in the world. And this is not simply an imposition of our language. One of the authors I like to read, who's not a Thomist but is an Aristotelian, is Leon Kass. And he says, rabbits are naturally afraid of foxes and coyotes, and they are naturally attracted to carrots. And this is not a matter of our imposition of species on the rabbits. This is just the way the world is. Animals, whether it's cats or dogs, have certain fixed natures, right? You can't teach a dog to, you can't expect a dog to do something that a horse would do or something that an elephant would do, right? There are certain potentials within the canine species. You could teach a dog to hunt or to go after certain birds or other things, to herd cows or sheep, I should say. But you can't teach it to swim in the way of underwater, the way a fish would, right? So it has certain limited potentials.
I've heard some people claim that somehow evolution undermines essentialism. And I know that a lot of the essentialists like Otterberg and Feser, they kind of laugh at that claim. Like they think it's a very unintelligible or, not a really strong claim. So how would you approach the issue?
I think first we need to get clear on our terms of species and kinds.
Mm-hmm.
The modern taxonomic tree, I'm not sure a Thomist would necessarily have to agree with. For example, when I look at canines, I don't think an Aristotelian would have to agree that Schnauzers and Great Danes and poodles are different kinds or different species. And the same thing with cats, different Siamese and so forth. So one question, and there was a book written probably 50 years ago raising this question of what does an Aristotelian mean by species?
Mm-hmm.
There are, in the book, this was by Mortimer Adler, he proposed there are 4 different possibilities. On the one, we could say, like the evolution, there are no species at all. Everything's just a constant flux, a constant difference of degree. On the other extreme, we may say, and a lot of scientists you'll hear speak about this, or biologists, that there's thousands upon millions of species where this species of a quail differs from that species of a quail, which differs from another species of a quail. I don't think those terms, or the Aristotelian or Thomist would commit himself to those terms. So that leaves sort of 2 basic options. One would say there's maybe 3 or 4 basic species. There are plants, there are animals, and there are humans. And so we have 3 species of living things. If I had to defend something at the hardcore level against an evolutionist, I would retreat to that position. Mm-hmm. But I think intuitively we would look at the world and say, okay, fish are different from land animals. They're different from birds. Dogs are fundamentally different from cats. Now, I don't know that a lion is fundamentally different from a cheetah, from a house cat, or a wolf is fundamentally different from a dog or a fox. So from an evolutionary perspective, I probably would not want to argue that, again, that a cheetah and a lion are fundamentally different species, because they seem to have basically the same feline traits. But on an average, everyday non-biologist, but educated human being, I would say canines and felines, dogs and cats, are fundamentally different. And both are fundamentally different from horses, which are different from giraffes, which are different from elephants. And all of those are different from fish, or from ducks, or from eagles. So in a broad sense, there seems to be a number of different species, but not thousands upon thousands.
All right. That's very interesting. I've also, going back to this act and potency,
Yes.
Fazer offers this Aristotelian proof from actual and potentials and so forth for the existence of God.
Yes.
But I was interested though in what's the difference between prime matter, which is just almost like the fundamental matter from which everything is basically created, and God? What's the difference between those 2 concepts for somebody from our tradition?
Sure. So in the tradition, prime matter is this, it's almost nothing. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's absolutely nothing, but it's a potential to become anything, whereas God is the opposite. He's not potential at all. He's fully act. So in this tradition, God is pure act, and his existence is his essence, whereas prime matter has no essence. It has, strictly speaking, no existence in a certain sense. It only exists insofar as a form actualizes it and makes it exist. So another way to think about this, and this was very helpful for me, matter and form, as well as prime matter, are conceptual tools to make sense of the world. They're not things. Composites are things. So you are a thing. You are a tangible thing. A dog is a tangible thing. A glass of water or a cup of coffee is a tangible thing. When I think about analyzing the coffee, I can break it down conceptually, but I may not be able to break it down physically. We can try to do that, and we can. The scientific renaissance and modern science does dissect human beings, but strictly speaking, a dead human being is not a human being anymore. It's a former human being. What we now have here is a decomposing body, decomposing corpse. So the terms matter and form are ways to think about change, but on their own, there is no matter somewhere out there, and there are no forms somewhere out there. This would be, again, contrary to Plato's position, who thinks, yeah, there may be a location, a realm somewhere where there are forms. Probably wouldn't say there's a location of them, but it was important for me in my PhD to come to this realization that matter and form are conceptual ways to think about the world. They're principles of change, but they themselves are not things in the world. So you can't go to the store and buy some form or find some prime matter.
Hmm.
But there is an analogous way where modern physicians speak about energy. We don't find pure energy somewhere. We find it contained in some form. So we might speak of gasoline as a form of energy, or coal as a form of energy, or sunlight as a form of energy. But they share this potential to produce energy, right? The underlying stuff that is energy, that is potential, is very similar to Aristotle's idea of matter. You don't find energy somewhere; you find it in packets of things that have a potential to energize.
So before we continue on to some of the other metaphysical views that are there, I'm interested in, I've heard some people talk about the problem of individuation.
Yes.
What is that problem, or what does that term mean?
Sure. I'm not entirely sure that it was a problem for Aristotle. Driving his notion of science is he wants to know what these forms were. There's an interesting passage in Homer's, I believe it's in the Iliad, where he identifies the captains of the ships, and he says the individual sailors on the ships, there are too many of them to know. And I think Aristotle quotes that. So when it comes to the billions of human beings, I can't know even a fraction of the billions of human beings, but I can know human beings. I can know that humans are rational. I can know certain things about humans. I can study psychology or counseling, and I can know if someone loses a loved one, the person will go through certain grief stages. A doctor knows that if someone has cancer, there are certain stages that this person goes through. So when it comes for Aristotle, I don't know that he's really interested in the individual. But with the birth of Christianity, where you and I are individual souls that have a judgment in the afterlife, and we will stand before God and we will live individually, that becomes a problem for an Aristotelian who believes in, let's say, the afterlife for you and me. There were Aristotelians who would say that when you and I die, we would simply go back into I wouldn't say the Godhead, but something like humanity in general, and we would cease existing as an individual. We would exist still as part of the divine or humanity or something like that, but we would lose our individuality. As you can imagine, if you know much about Christianity, that's not going to set well with Christian doctrines of the individual resurrection. So Aquinas and others have to say, okay, what is it that makes you an individual? There's different places, and this is not my area of expertise, but I've read a few articles on it. Different places in Aquinas, he seems to say different things. He seems to say accidents, quantity would individuate you. The problem with that view is that substance is prior to accidents. There are places where, because he makes a distinction between your essence and your existence, that maybe your existence individuates you, or the common view seems to be that there's a material factor that makes you individual. We might think of it this way: when a couple comes together, the embryology of the time was that the father provided the form and the mother provided the matter. There are two reasons why that intuitively makes sense. One is the connection between the word matter and mater, mother. You can see the words are almost identical, or they're related. But secondly, the father has nothing else to do with the child from then on as far as the growth of the child. What makes you grow inside of the woman, the embryo, the fetus develop, is the food, is the matter that the woman consumes. So the matter that the food that the woman eats seems to be what makes this individual an individual, right? And we could say, well, you eat different food. You and I may both eat a banana or a taco, but you're eating one part of matter and I'm eating another one. And so in the material realm, what seems to individuate us is the matter that you and I are comprised of. This has implications, I should add right quick, because on principle, by definition, matter is unknowable. It's always the form that is intelligible. So in the tradition, I can know essences and I can know forms of things, I can know mathematical truths, but when it comes to the individual, I cannot know you. I can see you, I can hear you, but I don't, strictly speaking, know you. And when I use the word know there, I'm using the equivalent of the word scientia, science. There is no science of you and there's no science of me. There's only science of human beings. And so an example from modern day that's similar to what Aquinas would say is a doctor can know in general what cancer would do. And if you have if someone comes to a doctor who smokes or who is generally physically fit, he can predict the course of this cancer as it will develop, right? I was told years ago, I read somewhere that people who lose a limb, a hand or a leg, if they smoke, doctors know that there's not enough oxygen. If they reattach the limb, there's not enough oxygen because of the habit of the person smoking for the limb to survive, so the limb will die. If you're a non-smoker and they sew the hand or the limb back on, you will have enough oxygen for that hand to live. So these would be general truths that we would know about smokers versus non-smokers. But how it applies to you, right, we don't exactly know. And the story that drove this, that I read this from, was a man who was a smoker who swore to the doctor that he would quit smoking, convinced the doctor to sew his hand on, only to find out a few weeks later that he couldn't break the habit, started smoking again, and lost his hand a second time. He went to the doctor, please reattach it. And the doctor said, no, you're not going to stop smoking. And he lost his hand as a result. So.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, I wanted to move on actually to maybe some of the other topics that we could hit, but I feel like there are two last questions I need to ask before we get into the other metaphysical views that challenge this one. So let me give them both to you at the same time so that you can hit both of them. Okay. So we were going to talk about mind and brain and the immateriality of the intellect. That was one thing we're going to discuss. And in particular, I've heard a lot of people say that, for example, what you are, you as the individual person, you are just your brain.
Okay.
And like maybe, you are just using your body, but you are not your body. So maybe actually there's the immateriality of the intellect, there's the human person. And the last thing I wanted to discuss is the relationship between essentialism and teleology.
Sure.
Because I remember discussing, the perverted faculty argument with somebody, and they just simply said, like, well, why do I, need to follow my telos or whatever? So we can hit all those areas if possible.
So the mind-brain problem, we know Aristotle knew that from his own experiments with dissecting animals, that animals have brains. For Aristotle, you have your 5 exterior senses, your ability to see, your ability to touch, your ability to hear, smell, and taste. And each of those have both a proper object, a unique object, and common objects. So, for example, I, strictly speaking, only see colors. Or I shouldn't say only see colors, but what's unique to my vision is the ability to see colors. I cannot hear colors, I cannot smell colors, I can't taste colors. When it comes to sounds, I cannot smell sounds, taste sounds, see sounds. However, I know that if I'm taking a red marker and tapping it on the blackboard or the whiteboard, that it's the round cylindrical object hitting the whiteboard that's making the sound. I don't know this by seeing it or by hearing it. There has to be some other faculty that puts these two together. Or just take shapes. I could see that my phone is flat or has a flat surface, but I could also, if I were blind, I could feel that it's flat. So feeling the shape of it or seeing the shape of it is common to more than one sensation. Aristotle thinks that there's some internal sense faculty, which we would say is the brain, that coordinates those. We also have things like an instinct. When you taste something, you generally react in such a way that it's either pleasant or painful. So your ability to experience this as pleasant and to judge it as pleasant, or to judge it as painful and to spit it out. Or if you're listening to radio and you hear a song that you like and you want to turn it up, or you hear a song you hate and you turn it off. This judgment would be, for Aristotle, a part of the brain would be a physical thing that you would share with animals. This is not what makes you a human being. In contrast to the animals, human beings have language. Animals can communicate, but language is far different than communication. We know that bees communicate with other bees. We know that most species communicate with other within their species. Human beings have an artificial language. We're using English. Other people around the world can use German or Italian or Japanese, what have you. And those are artificial languages, but they have a similar grammar and they map onto the world. This ability to grasp what something is different from animals. There's absolutely no evidence that animals identify what something is, right? Then they may identify that something is painful or threatening. Aristotle knew this, that a sheep seeing for the very first time a wolf recognizes that it's harm. So animals have this instinctual ability to grasp things that are threatening or things that are edible. And these are natural instincts. But to classify things, to have things like histories, dogs and cats don't keep their histories. They don't keep a genealogy where they came from. They don't enter into a marriage contract the way we do. They don't make works of art the way that we do. Yes, beavers build dams. Birds will build a nest. But we will build houses and we'll draw upon all different styles, and we realize that there's a function to this, and we'll classify them. So this ability to classify. There's a neuroscientist, he passed away a few years ago, by the name of Oliver Sacks, and he had an interesting essay. The book was called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and he describes a person who has a form of agnosia, where the person could not recognize what something was by his sight. So the examples he gave was, he showed this person a glove, and he looked at the glove and he says, well, I see that it's a flat object and it has 5 appendages. And he says, what is it? He said, I don't have a clue what it is. And the guy puts it on his hand, and as soon as he touched it, he said, oh, that's a glove. And the doctor gave him a rose, and he said, describe what you see. And he says, well, I see a stem with pointy things on it, and I see red, and I see green. So what is it? He said, I don't know what it is. And then he said, smell it. And he smelled it. He said, oh, that's a rose. So it was interesting because by his sight, he lost this capacity to say what something was. Now, that for Aristotle, this ability to say what something is, to apprehend the concept of things, while it's tied to your brain, is separate from your brain. And the ability to form sentences or the ability to reason in syllogisms, all of these are not the same thing as your brain. They're not products of the brain. Again, the brain influences these things. You think in terms of images, but the brain produces images, but the concepts, Aristotle thinks, are immaterial. So that's a brief analysis of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I was getting onto it. So,
okay.
So that was about the immateriality of the intellect, a little bit about the human person, right?
Yes.
But I really want to talk more about the human person, if that's okay with you,
sure.
right?
Absolutely.
So a lot of people kind of think that we are, a Cartesian composite? I don't know if that's the right word. Or
soul and a body, yes. The Cartesian dualism.
Right. And then for a lot of us as natural law theorists, we say, no, the mind and body are a unity. They're not completely separate. What does that mean, and how would we explain it or maybe defend it to somebody?
Sure. So historically, if we go back to Descartes, I have some slight sympathies with Descartes. Scholasticism by the 1600s was onerous. By the time, even 200 years before, you would spend 2 or 3 years studying basic logic, then you'd spend 2 or 3 years studying physics, and then 2 or 3 years studying psychology, another couple of years studying ethics, and then 2 or 3. So your general education, which would start probably around 13 or 14, would take a good 10 to 12, 13, 14 years. There was very little, if any, studying of the physical universe. And by the 1630s, modern science was taking off. So one of many revolutionary thinkers of the time period, but he starts this on this radical doubt where he says that in order for you to know something, we need to doubt everything. From doubting everything, he comes to the proposition that I think, therefore I am, the famous cogito ergo sum. from that, he raises the question, what am I? He says, I am a thinker. We're to read that in context, because a thinking animals, not pure thinking things. But then he separates the entire physical world, including our human bodies, as inanimate stuff. So the world no longer is hierarchically arranged with corporeal things and then living things and animals and humans. All of that is done away with, and we have a simple division between the thinking things, the rational beings, which would include angels and God, and the entire physical universe. Historically, he writes both in Latin and in French, but there's a whole community that begins, or that's already well underway outside of the university. Scientific circles are developing that are interested in exploring science. And so you mentioned teleology. Teleology was set on the back burner or simply argued that it's not relevant. Descartes, in an interesting passage, actually, he doesn't say that things don't have a purpose. He acknowledges that God had a purpose for creating things, but in a kind of a false humility says, oh, who am I as a human being to know what God wanted as to why horses exist or why turtles exist? I can't know the purpose of these things. So let me, out of humility, not look for purposes in things. Insofar as the world in the 17th century, France and Holland and others were largely Judeo-Christian, this wasn't a serious problem, because the world, the European context, they had morality drawn from their Christian Judeo background. But if you go back to Aristotle and you look at Plato, one of the things you may know about Socrates is that he was accused of denying the gods. There's an interesting passage in Plato's Republic where he's talking to, I believe it's Adeimantus, and he says, what should we say about the gods? And he's describing this perfect city. And Socrates says, well, we should say what's true about God. And he switches from the questions, what should we say about gods? And he says, we should say what's true about God. And then he says, God is just and God is good. Now, for us, when I taught this, when I read this early on in grad school, and then I first started teaching it years ago, I never noticed this. But for a Greek to hear that God is good, that would have been a staggering, like, where did you come up with this notion, Socrates? I mean, they knew about Socrates and his contemporaries knew about God from Homer. And Homer tells you about Zeus. And Zeus is anything but the god of Christianity. Zeus is a philanderer. He kills people. He changes his form into animals. I mean, he's a pagan writ large. He's a glorified heathen, if you will. And the same is true for all the other gods and goddesses. They're nothing like the gods, the morality that you get in Judeo-Christianity. So when you see this tradition in the 17th century, setting aside teleology, the connection, and I think you want to go here with this, the connection between teleology and morality, it wasn't such an issue because of the cultural Christianity and Judaism and Islam that pervaded the world. The average person out there would have believed the Christian message, or even if he didn't necessarily believe the Christian message or the Judeo message, he understood the culture at large, believed that there was right and wrongs. Today, that whole fabric has come undone. The American Revolution has separated the state from the church, and so we no longer think of religion as authoritative. We no longer think of the claims, the Ten Commandments, for example, as authoritative. And once we've done that, we're left back to a Heraclitean flux where morality doesn't matter. Earlier at the beginning of this conversation, you asked about metaphysics, and I talked about consequences. If you think that there are no essences in the world and you think you could become any sort of thing you want, then there's nothing to stop you from becoming a Columbine killer or the Dayton shooter. There's nothing to guide you, right? But if you look at the world and you detect that there are these essences in the world and that there's something tied to humans are the only animals out there that have a justice system. When my dog killed a bird or killed a squirrel, or actually he couldn't catch the squirrels, but he could catch the badgers. When he killed those, the other badgers didn't come and lock him up and have a a jury trial, and say, you killed one of our family members, and we're going to take you to court. But we do this all the time as humans. It's occurred to me more and more as I've been teaching Latin that the whole grammatical structure in the ancient and Middle Ages was all built around a court system. Aristotle's categories was all about accusations. If you've studied any Latin or Greek, you know that there's the accusative case. The accusative case is based on the court system of an accusation. And when you throw someone under the bus, right, you lay blame at someone. What you're doing is you're blaming that person as the subject. The subject literally means to be thrown under. The subject of the accusation is one that's been thrown under this cause. And when a prosecutor or a defense attorney says objection, there's a grammatical connection between the objection in the court system and the direct object of grammar. So the whole grammar system that we use in Latin and Greek and to some extent English is all built around a court system of accusations and objections and the subject that has been thrown under or that has been accused.
All right, so for the sake of time, I can actually reduce all of the questions I have left to maybe just like one little question. So the question I have left is basically, what are the alternative views to essentialism, and why are they, let's say, false?
Okay.
Or you can go into some of them, not all of them.
Yeah. No, I think the main one, the only one I really want to talk about would be nominalism. And earlier, I'm going to go back to something we said earlier because I think this is very helpful, and this will be actually helpful for some of those who've had a little more training in Thomism. The question of individuation, what makes you individual? Aquinas says that what makes you an individual is your matter. And as I said earlier, matter is not intelligible. So for Aquinas, if you've read Plato, you know there's the divided line. Outside of the cave is the world that is intelligible. Inside the world, or on the lower half of the divided line, are the individuals. And strictly speaking, they are sensible, but they're not knowable. So we'd have things that are knowable or intelligible on the upper half of the divided line, and we'd have things on the bottom half that are individual or sensible. And that was a hard, fast distinction until you get to Duns Scotus. Scotus, interestingly enough, thinks that what makes you an individual is your form. He rejects Aquinas' view that what makes you an individual is the matter. He says that what makes you an individual is your form. Now, he doesn't draw the consequences of this. He will say, I think, hypothetically, that God could know everything about you. So God would have a scientific knowledge of you, but you and I wouldn't have a scientific knowledge of each other. So he's going to hold on to the tradition there, but twist it slightly. The thinker who comes after him is William of Occam. And it strikes me that what William of Occam does is says, look, if you have your own form, if you are knowable as an individual, I don't need this whole metaphysical world of essences. You exist, you are an individual, and you have your own identity. You are knowable as an individual. So all of this metaphysics can be set aside. All of these essences, Occam says, are simply names. So the word nominalism comes from the Latin word that means name, nomen. And so there aren't any essences in the world. Those are just names. So when I look at you and another person, I say you're both human beings. I have the name that's the same for you, but there's nothing really the same about you. If, hypothetically, I wanted to say you and a dog were the same thing, and I wanted to say the dog was a person, okay, because there's no essence to you. So we could look at this and we'd say, well, in the Holocaust, we could say that these Jews weren't really humans. They're something else, because humanity is just a name that we give them, and we can identify the Aryans as real humans and these other people as non-humans. You could say the same thing about slavery. You could say these slaves weren't really human. They weren't persons. And so we don't have to count them. We'll give them 3/5 for counting. Same thing today with abortion, right? Abortionists would say, well, the fetus is not really a human being. There's no essence there. It's just a clump of cells. And so we can have the woman's right to abort that child or that baby. So it has drastic consequences, whether it's slavery, whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's abortion, other issues. If we simply say there aren't any essences, things that are just names, and we can just impose names however we want, that simply undoes all of our morality and all of ethics.
Hmm. I mean, and I've heard, I think it was Hilary Putnam who had, I think it was called the miracles objection or something like that, if I'm
I
understanding it
know of the
properly.
name, but I don't know of the argument. So go ahead, explain.
I think she said something like, it would be very strange if, like, so the talk of essence and essentialism and all the concepts, these are extremely effective at mapping and understanding what we consider to be
Oh,
reality. So
sure.
she would say it would have to be some kind of miracle if it was false, if it really wasn't getting onto something, and if nominalism were true and it was just a linguistic
Yeah,
kind of, exercise.
that would make sense, right? Because when the non-philosopher, the working person out there, understands, as animals do, right? I mentioned a moment ago, the rabbit. The rabbit instinctually knows that the dog is the predator. The dog knows that the rabbit is food, and it instinctually knows this. When the guy was hiking in Colorado and he was attacked by a bear, there was an instinctual awareness. This was another kind of thing, and no one at all accused this man of murder because he killed the bear when he strangled the bear, right? But if you were to do that, so we have the case recently of Epstein, right? There are questions whether he was murdered or not. So when a human being strangles another human being, we all rally around and say, was this just, or was this a case of defense, self-defense, or was this murder? But if you kill an animal, when you go to a butcher and the butcher kills a cow, and later that evening we go out for steak, there are some PETA people or some vegans who will question this, but our justice system doesn't condemn the butcher as a murderer for killing a cow or for killing a pig. So there are, apart from some extreme vegans or others, for the most part, we have a sort of an intuitive sense on these things.
Right, and I think that's right. So, Professor Newton, I want to thank you for coming out and talking to me today. I think this is actually one of my favorite interviews that I've done on the show. So, hopefully next time we can talk more about ethics and get into some interesting subjects. But for now, I think I'm quite satisfied with our discussion on metaphysics. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we go?
I think we've hit most of the high points. So I look forward to talking to you again, and I've enjoyed this as well.
All right, thank you so much. And this will be the end of the episode for now. Stay tuned for, I think next week I'll be debating Benjamin Watkins again about ethics and some other issues. I'm going to be trying to talk to an anarchist, talking to all sorts of different people. So stay tuned to Intellectual Conservatism. Thank you.